The Nether Chocolate Bunny. This sweet little guy is produced at a rate of 14,638 units per day, reaching a production count of 2 million in just 6 short months. But what lies beneath this adorable, successful, and delicious little confection is perhaps a little bit sour. Mr. Nether, proprietor of the Nether Chocolate Factory, appears to be guilty of complete disregard for the Fair Labor Standards Act, absolute negligence of basic OSHA standards, and if I'm being honest, I don't think the FDA would be too happy either. Essentially, what I'm trying to say is this zucchini man should be in jail. Now, before we get into the real nitty-gritty, perhaps we should have a bit of background. Rack, Shack, and Benny, the VeggieTales video released in 1995, follows after the biblical story of Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, 3 Israelite men who were taken from their homes along with several others to be these learned and knowledgeable men for the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar. They were also given the Babylonian names of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, which I'll be referring to them as from this point on because that's all they're ever referred to as after Daniel chapter 1, which is really sad if you think about in any capacity. But these selected people were to partake of the king's pantry, which included rich meats and wine, planned for about 3 years before they were to be brought before the king. Instead of doing that, for 10 days, our main boys ate pulse, which is essentially only food from the ground and water. And at the end of the 10 days, they were proven to be in better form than anyone who ate from the king's table. So then that's what this crew eats for the remainder of the 3 years. God grants them wisdom. And at the end of the appointed time, they were brought before the king and found to be more favorable than all of the others, and so were made responsible for the affairs of the province of Babylon. After an indeterminate amount of time, King Nebuchadnezzar erects a golden statue of himself and calls forth all the powerful people within Babylon to worship said statue. At the sound of the cornet, flute, harp, sackbut, psaltery, dulcimer, and all kinds of music, and whoso falleth not down and worshippeth shall the same hour be cast into the midst of a burning fiery furnace. Yikes! So it comes to light that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are not worshipping the statue, and the king confronts them. And not only does he do exactly what he threatened to do, i.e., throwing them into a furnace, but he explicitly commands for the fires to be heated 7 times hotter than usual. But the 3 are not only not harmed from this ordeal, in fact, they are delivered by a figure who is described as like the Son of God. Then King Nebuchadnezzar takes back his ruling about having to worship the statue and makes a decree that every people, nation, and language which speak anything amiss against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be cut in pieces and their houses shall be made a dunghill, because there is no other God that can deliver after this sort. I'm sorry, what? Cut into pieces? House made into a dunghill? No, don't do that. Excuse me, sir, I know you're the king and all, but you can't just threaten to murder people for not agreeing with you, change your mind, and then threaten to murder people again, but just a different group of people. Just 5 minutes ago, you were about to kill these guys. What the hell, man? Gee, I wonder how they're going to adapt this one for a kid's show. Well, more or less verbatim, actually. You just take the king's palace setting and change it into a chocolate factory, and instead of wise men and princes, they're employees. And instead of King Nebuchadnezzar, it's the CEO, Mr. Nether. Now, there is no giant golden statue of their boss. Instead, it's a giant bunny they have to worship. And they still get thrown into a furnace at the end. You know, for kids. But changing all these elements, from a king to a CEO, from a palace to a place of employment, but keeping the fiery furnace, although an integral part of the story, leaves me to wonder, where's the union? The whole point of a union is to keep your boss from doing stuff like this. Because this could have been easily prevented if people just looked for the warning signs. But no one seems to have, at least not to my knowledge. So I'll put in the legwork. The VeggieTales episode, Rack, Shack, and Benny, opens with a song that sets up the viewer for the bureaucratic nightmare they're about to endure.
Because we work real hard at the chocolate factory. We start at 8 and we don't get lunch
When applicable, I'm going to be going off of Illinois labor regulations, as that's where Big Idea was located during production of this episode. According to the Illinois Compiled Statutes, Chapter 820, Act Listing 140, Section 3, every employer shall permit its employees who are to work for 7.5 continuous hours or longer at least 20 minutes for a meal period beginning no later than 5 hours after the start of the work period. That is a whole 2 hours difference, and they should be getting a break. Now, you might think, well, maybe they only work 7 hours, so therefore their break can be at any point during the shift. But if they're working less than the required amount of hours, why would they even have a break to start with? You know? Going off of the unfair treatment of employees for the rest of this episode, I'm going to assume that if they don't need a break, i.e. if they're working less than 7.5 hours, then they're not going to get one at all, which is unfortunate. Within this same song, we have
It's almost 8:02, I'll tell Nezer that you're late and he'll take it from your check.
which is not illegal per se. I found a blog post from someone who contacted the American Department of Labor, and although it's very common for companies to round hours worked, it's not mandatory, and if you decide to do it, you're even allowed going so far as to fractions of a minute. But this particular line of the song is told to Laura Carrot, and earlier she was at the front of the gate and said that it was almost 8. So she was on company premises before the start of her shift, it just took her time to get to the actual building. Also, she seems to be making some kind of delivery to the factory, so if there was any kind of tie-up at the previous location, that could account for her tardiness as well. Also, like, off topic, but I love that this gate is, like, completely ineffective because they have flying cars. Next point. Again, in the very first song, we have this P, who has clearly been injured on the job and is told to suck it up.
With all this work to do, we've got no time for sympathy.
It's not called sympathy, it's called the Workers' Compensation Law. This injury should be reported, and this P should be given time off. And once more, within this opening number, we work the whole week through to make a buck or two. Now, I'm going to be generous and assume that the latter is just an exaggeration of how little they're making in comparison to how hard the employees are working along with the cost of living, and that the factory workers are making minimum wage, which in Illinois is $8.25 an hour. Boy, that's low. But that's not what I'm talking about here. The state of Illinois requires employers to give workers 24 consecutive hours off within a calendar week. It's called the 1-Day Rest in 7 Act. These workers need time off. Also in this song, it's implied that lunch is the only break they get, and stopping to rest risks them losing their jobs, which is entirely legal because Illinois is an at-will employment state. So you can actually be fired for any reason at all, as long as it's not illegal, such as discrimination or retaliation. But workers with union jobs can only be fired for just cause. In fact, most, if not all of these issues could be solved, or at the very least made more manageable, if the Nezer factory workers were to unionize. But that's not where we stop here. All these issues are just found in one single song. This factory setup, as weird and unrealistic as it is, having these mechanical hands hanging around like it's fucking Roger Rabbit or something, still needs to adhere to proper guidelines. This is a chocolate factory where consumable products that people will eat are being produced. I'm not asking for employees to wear gloves because they do not have hands, but I do ask for hairnets. I do not care if most of them are bald. Some of them do have hair, and those who don't still risk contaminating the product with dandruff or sweat. And they do in fact sweat.
Hurry up and tell the story. My head's starting to sweat.
We also have violations of child labor laws. Laura, despite being able to drive for some reason, which is another issue entirely in and of itself, is implied in later episodes to be the same or approximate age as Junior Asparagus. who is 6. And the child labor law regulates the employment of anyone under 16 years of age. 2 of those regulations are requiring a certificate confirming that not only can they work, but also that the work they are doing will not interfere with their education, which I think working every day of the week from 8 a.m. until God knows when is going to interfere with that. Secondly, minors cannot work in any kind of hazardous occupation. And boy, is this place hazardous. So that's 2 counts at a minimum. We have no idea how old these peas are supposed to be. Also, we get this cool pull-out shot that shows off more or less the entire factory, with elevated walkways and giant vats of molten chocolate. And there is not a single guardrail in sight. In general, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, or OSHA, requires fall protection for unprotected edges or sides and 4 feet or more of drop distance. Now, this is where things get tricky. In order to tell if these elevations require guardrails or not, we need to know how tall the vegetables are. Now, you could take a standard real-life produce from the grocery store and use that to determine that Bob the Tomato is 3 inches tall. Or you could take that Phil Vischer once said QWERTY is an IBM 386 computer, and using the size of that particular model, you could compare them and figure out how tall they're supposed to be. But the 386 is a microprocessor and is used in a variety of different personal computers. So you would have to find the exact model that uses said processor in order to find what the measurements you need are. Just from the placement of his floppy disk drive, I'm inclined to believe he's an 8556, but it's not a 1-to-1 match, so I could be wrong. But we don't need to do either of those, because within this episode, we're given a very specific scale. The bunny statue that they need to bow down and sing to is 90 feet tall. This is actually entirely biblically accurate. The image of gold is said to be 60 or 60 cubits tall. A cubit has a wide range of lengths depending on which culture is using the term, but in the biblical sense, it's the length of the forearm from the elbow to the tip of the middle finger. Now, they must have had some pretty long arms in ancient Babylon because my cubit is just over 16 inches, but the general accepted standard is 18. So 60 times 18, that's 10,060 inches. Then divided by 12 to get feet, and we're at 90 exactly. But back to the task at hand. It's left unclear if they mean this rabbit is 90 feet from its paws to the tip of its ears, or from its ears to the ground. I'm choosing to go with the latter, because the idea of a 20-foot tall zucchini terrifies me to no end. So the alternative means that Mr. Nezer is about 11 feet tall, which is still scary. Just not as. I determined this by taking this screenshot in which the bunny is 579 pixels tall and Nezer is 71 pixels. Dividing those gave me 8.154929577. Then I divide the height of the bunny in inches by this new number to get Mr. Nezer's height, and then convert that into feet and inches, or just feet in this case. Using this same method, we can determine that Larry is 8'6", Junior is 5'2", and Bob is 4'5". Huh. I guess VeggieTales Live is more accurate than I thought. Knowing these heights, we can tell with just one look that these elevations need guardrails. But because I already put the math in, I'll let you know that from the top elevation to the mid one is 19 feet and 1 inch. And over on the side here, there's no walkway underneath, so that's an even greater draw. Get some guardrails in this factory! But that's not all. Powered platforms, guardrail. Conveyor belt danger zones need to be guarded. I think a chute that ends into a giant furnace qualifies as a danger zone. Speaking of conveyors, they also require safe practices. Tying up your employees and putting them on a conveyor belt with the intention of dropping them down said danger zone chute is an unsafe practice. Stairways have a maximum riser height of 9.5 inches. The riser height here is almost 21 inches high. And each flight of stairs with at least 3 treads and 4 risers needs a stair rail system. This part's easy, just take a glance and you can tell that there's more stairs than that. These other staircases aren't compliant either, by the way. Oh look, another unprotected ledge that needs a guardrail. I swear each time I turn around there's another violation I didn't see before. Did I mention these 2 open vats of molten chocolate with no protection? Because 2 carrots fall into these and are probably dead. OSHA Standard 1910.263, titled Bakery Equipment, which was the absolute closest I could find, says that chocolate melting, refining, and mixing kettles shall be provided with a cover to enclose the top. This should not have happened. It's the next day. And finally, the main star of the show, the furnace. I don't know if I just wasn't looking hard enough, but I couldn't find any kind of regulations concerning any kind of furnaces or incinerators or anything like that. I found a list that showed various examples of what may qualify as an industrial process, but not any kind of rules to how they should be operated. So I went back to Bakery Equipment and decided to go with their oven requirements. I mean, what's a furnace anyway, but just a really big oven? Speaking of ovens, they need to be away from main passageways and exits. Here is the furnace. Here is an unlabeled exit, which is another violation in its own right. Here is a walkway. In the case of a fire or explosion, there is a great risk of injury. A main disconnect switch or circuit breaker shall be provided, and so located that it can be reached quickly and safely. I do not see a single such switch or any other kind of shutoff valve. I do not care if Mr. Lunt can operate this from a distance. That's not easily accessible. And the fact that the top of this furnace can just be opened at will is very concerning to me, considering the extreme lack of guardrails. So, if you worked somewhere that was hazardous to your safety, and your employer clearly did not care about giving you fair working hours or basic workers' rights, and then he threw you into an industrial-size oven because you wouldn't sing his favorite song, if that was something you somehow managed to survive, what would you do? If you said quit or go to HR, you're wrong. I wouldn't be surprised if there was no HR department at Nezer Factories. No. What happens is Mr. Nezer has a heel turn fast enough to give me whiplash, and our protagonists instantly forgive him. Excuse me, I know this is the end of the episode and things need to be wrapped up, but holy shit. Please call the Illinois Department of Labor. They're there to help. So yeah, if someone wants you to do something and you don't want to, just say no and they'll instantly change their mind. Yeah, that's totally how life works. Like, no, there's nothing wrong with holding to what you believe. Aaron Tippin once said, you've got to stand for something or you'll fall for anything. But, you're probably not gonna get too many people on your side, let's be real. With the plot and far too many workers' rights violations out of the way, this episode comes with some controversies, one of which is fun. The other is really serious, and I don't think enough people acknowledge it. And we're going to start with the latter. The characters Mr. Nezer and Mr. Lunt are first introduced in this episode and become all-around characters for the rest of the franchise. Mr. Nezer is explicitly an homage to Oogie Boogie from Nightmare Before Christmas, who is voiced by Ken Page, an African-American man. Mr. Lunt is said to be inspired by the weasels from Roger Rabbit, and is described as quasi-Italian, quasi-Latino, which is not how accents work. And both of these new characters, who are oftentimes villains, are voiced by Phil Vischer, who is very, very white. December 3rd of 2018, thecollegefix.com had an article about Drew Van Voris San Diego State University's annual Whiteness Forum, where one project claims that all the villains in VeggieTales are coded as ethnic minorities, and having the white-coded protagonists triumph over the characters of color teaches children that whiteness is what's good or right, and minorities are the root of evil. Ignoring the fact that within Christianity, sin is the root of evil. This could be an accurate judgment of the show if it was correct, but only about 15 to 17% of these characters' appearances in the franchise involve them being in some kind of antagonistic role. The project also argues that many of the racially coded characters are presented as irredeemable, which is also untrue. More than half the time, these characters do get redeemed by the end. Also, not to harp on whoever made this project too much, but the visual aid they use is clearly a screenshot from the Pirates Who Don't Do Anything movie, which is a film where the villain is British. I don't know if they just didn't do any research or if they somehow think that British people are minorities. So if this College Fix article is entirely inaccurate, why do I bring it up? Because about a week later, Phil talks about it in his podcast, The Holy Post. He debunks the article using a lot of the same points that I just made, but then he goes on to defend his use of ethnic accents, even saying that he's heard it before, so it's not news to him that he shouldn't be doing these kinds of voices. And it's actually specifically this reason that Nezer doesn't appear in the Netflix reboot, VeggieTales in the House or City, as DreamWorks supposedly has a policy against characters of color being portrayed by white actors, except they completely missed Mr. Lunt, or maybe they thought he was just more Italian or something. It also must be a relatively new policy, because that wasn't something DreamWorks seemed concerned about at all in the past. And complains to an effect that PC culture is killing comedy, which is ultimately untrue. There are plenty of successful comedians who don't make joke at the expense of marginalized communities. But for the whole segment of the podcast, Phil doesn't seem to understand the real problem, and it's been a discussion in the animation industry for years now. This podcast was from 2018, so there was already a lot of stuff about this readily available to you. But this was almost 2 years ago. Maybe he's learned from his past. On Twitter, he's been a vocal supporter of the Black Lives Matter movement and has even attended marches himself. In June of this year, he posted a video about systemic racism in America, which went viral and got a follow-up in August. This was kind of a big deal, as a lot of conservative white Christians often look up to him. And he seems to be trying to use his platform and influence to educate white Christians who still hold on to racist ideals. And in the newest VeggieTales reboot, The VeggieTales Show, Mr. Nezer has returned, but no longer voiced by Vischer. He's now voiced by David Mann of Tyler Perry fame. So maybe Phil has learned something in the past 2 years after all. Well, he's still voicing Mr. Lunt, so probably not. Also on Twitter, he revealed that it was Big Idea's decision for a recast, and hints that he may be reprising his role at some point. So really, did you learn anything, man? And if you really wanted these characters to sound this particular way, you could have at least hired actors of color to portray them. I know Big Idea was a small company at the time, but they got Kellogg's voice actor Jeff Morrow for the second episode. But if they really didn't have the budget to do something like that again, were there really no African American or Latino men at Phil's church in 1995? That's where you got Kurt Heineke and Dan Anderson. Could you not give out any more roles to the congregation? Despite having created the childhoods of many people who grew up in Christian households, myself included, Vischer is a person with many flaws, and although he seems to genuinely want to educate his fellow white Christians, it doesn't absolve him of his racist actions that he continues to this day. If anything, it makes it seem like he's trying to cover his past up, which is not great. Like, just admit and plan to do better. Nor is it up to me or other white fans of his work to forgive him. And it's such a prevalent aspect within the show too, it just seems kind of strange to be ignoring it. And as this episode was the introduction of the two characters with the most controversy, this seemed like the most natural place to bring it up. I said this episode has two main controversies surrounding it. I'm going to talk about the fun one now to try to end this on a slightly more positive note. The bunny song controversy. If you're familiar with VeggieTales, you've probably already heard this. It's pretty common knowledge. The bunny song is a song from Rakshak and Benny, Olia of where the Bible says that they were to bow down at the sound of the cornet and the flute and all that jazz. The characters are to bow down and sing the bunny song. It's regarded as a villain song, and has a lot of lyrics with bad morals within it, because it's a song that the main characters are not supposed to sing. But the song they made was so catchy that Big Idea got letters from parents saying that they heard their kids singing "I don't love my mom" and "I don't love my dad" in the middle of the grocery store. So they made 2 alternative versions. They made a new and improved bunny song for the upcoming sing-along video, with new lyrics and a positive message that kids were allowed to sing to. And then for future releases of the actual episode, they altered some of the worst lines so that it was still bad, but wouldn't be nearly as bad if your kid started singing it in public. And then they got some letters from people saying they preferred the original version. Can't please them all, can ya? Now, if you're familiar with the Book of Daniel, you might have noticed something at the beginning. Instead of doing that, for 10 days, our main boys ate pulse. I lied. Sort of. It is true that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego ate only pulse before going before the king. But it wasn't their idea. It was Daniel's. And it's this in combination with Daniel chapter 10 where the modern-day Daniel fast stems from. And in Daniel chapter 2, Daniel specifically requests for Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to be promoted. And verse 49 ends with, "But Daniel sat in the gate of the king." So in chapter 3, when King Nebuchadnezzar gathers everyone in the palace to worship his golden image, why is Daniel never mentioned? Was he on vacation and so wasn't in the palace at the sound of the cornet? Was he sleeping? Did he decide to bow down to the statue? Christians will get really mad at you if you insinuate that last one. Because how dare you imply that this man who's been dead for thousands of years might have at one point wanted to save his own ass, despite the fact that many of the anointed kings of Israel have had lapses in judgment before, including David, who is described as a man after God's own heart, yet committed adultery and sent the woman's husband to be killed in war. For the most part, the characters in the Bible are human and are allowed to make mistakes. And so I'm allowed to entertain the idea that maybe Daniel did bow, because the Bible doesn't say either way. And who am I hurting by contemplating that possibility? Absolutely no one. But anyway, the Nezzer Chocolate Factory and Nezzer Chocolate Incorporated are riddled with subpar workers' rights and OSHA violations up the wazoo. The employees should either unionize and demand better working conditions, or the entire factory should just be shut down completely, honestly. And Mr. Nezzer should be penalized with, like, fines or whatever jail rich people go to for tax evasion. Not that they do, because they can just bribe their way out, but you know what I mean. Also, don't voice characters of color if you're white. That's really bad. And with that, I don't know, whatever thing people say to end videos. Insert clever closure line here. We also meet George for the first time in this episode, and he says this.
Now, Mr. Nezzer's not a bad man.
So I don't trust anything he says.